Unit 2 is an interesting discussion. Uh, 23 superintendents were given a list of questions, and they were supposed to answer these questions and have discussions about race and class. And I'm going to give you the actual questions here, and then just give you a couple tidbits of themes that were taken from all these 23 superintendents. So the first question was, has race, class, and achievement gap been an issue in your district? Has there been a critical incident in your district related to these issues? What problems or obstacles have you experienced in other conversations about these issues? What resources, actions, or attitudes have you found helpful in addressing race and class issues in your district? And what do you think remains unaddressed about these issues in your district? So after all these questions, some key themes came out of all of these discussion topics. So first, that each superintendent's situation was highly idiosyncratic. And what this means is each told a detailed and specific story that included the history of his or her own district, the economic climate, the roles and fates of previous superintendents, and the like. One suburban superintendent said candidly, "I have it much easier than some of my colleagues." The second was the respondent's race and class identity was also a factor, which makes sense that where you grow up, what you think you identify with should have, basically should have some backing in what you discuss and how you answer questions. Superintendents of color all indicated that they brought different perspectives to these issues than their white colleagues. Superintendents of color were also more likely to report personal attacks as a relatively routine parts of their job than white superintendents. 3, the issue of authority or who was in charge was woven throughout many of the stories. Some superintendents described particular difficulties in change initiatives in their districts. Resistance seemed more likely an intervention that focused attention on systematic change rather than student issues, and that threatened a shift in adult power. One respondent noted that for some superintendents, encouraging shared ownership for outcomes implied they might lose some of their authority. A fourth theme that came out was there was a wide variation in complexity of professional understanding of the role of the superintendent. Many images from this discussion emerged from the interviews, including managers, morale leaders, orchestra conductors, and politicians. The complexities in these different images seem directly related to the sense of efficacy or the belief that leadership actions could help close the achievement gap. So I found this one pretty interesting. The fact that if you believe you can close it, then you can. But if you don't have this efficacy or the belief that leadership or as a superintendent you can control what happens, then it doesn't happen. I thought that was kind of interesting. Superintendents also understand that the dynamics of race and class can the lines of adaptive technical change. It says most issues of race and class are classical adaptive work for leaders. Others gravitate toward the issue of technical problems. These respondents are more inclined to focus on answers instead of raising questions. But both groups are interested in what they can do themselves and with their communities to make progress. And the last theme was examining race and class is a continuing struggle, but one that needs to be met head on. One specific superintendent noted there are significant issues that we have to get out on the table. This whole issue of race and class weaves its magic by the fact that it's usually avoided rather than confronted. So it's undoubtedly true that these issues continue to challenge educators. Why wouldn't they? They continue to challenge us as a nation. So we're going to shift to the next unit, sub-unit, I guess, which is, can we actually close this gap? And what are some specific data discussions within this idea of gap? And we're going to kind of use the superintendent's discussion to have this discussion of can we close the gap. So there's 2 quotes from this I thought were interesting. It says, "No question about it, there are huge gaps in terms of minority dropout rates and the achievement gap. The achievement gap is a very big problem. In my former district, Hispanics and African Americans range from the bottom quartile to the lower end of the third quartile. Low-income Caucasians range from the middle of the second quartile to the middle of the third, and the middle-class whites range from the middle of the top to the 90th percentile." And this is pretty much true for a lot of discussion that was had with these superintendents. So the first thing to consider is race and district complexity as factors in superintendents responses. So the complexity of your race and district factored what superintendents said about things. And here are some interesting statistics. 1 in 8 white superintendents that had this discussion reported that the achievement gap was not a problem. Only 1 in 16 minority superintendents shared that view, which is interesting to me that both white and minority superintendents, those in highly complex districts, are more likely to report that the gap is not a problem. Nearly twice as many white superintendents in highly complex districts agreed that the gap is not a problem, 18% compared with 10%, although 7% of minority leaders of highly complex districts reported that the gap is not a problem. No minority superintendent in less complex districts did so. So it's an interesting idea. The discussion, though, did center around, so if we want to close the gap, these are 2 quotes from 2 superintendents, you need to be able to change every single dollar that's spent. This means reallocating funds away from existing programs and maybe even schools in middle-class neighborhoods. Middle-class parents are often the biggest challenge. They want their children's schools unchanged. It matters a lot to them that their schools have lots of languages and lots of science options. They also know that the major investments in school districts serving the disadvantaged would threaten what they now enjoy. So yes, it's interesting that the superintendents reported that they don't even see it as an issue, but really it is one. And they believe, and I thought this was really interesting, they believe that most superintendents believe they will have the problem of the achievement gap controlled in under half a decade. So while they believe that some believe that it wasn't an issue, the majority believe that it was, but yet what they're doing now, they could have this whole thing fixed up in less than 5 years. Or less than 10, I guess, is probably a better way to say it, which is interesting. So, okay, so if it can be fixed in 10 years, how do you do it? And honestly, it cannot be done just at school. Schools cannot do this alone. From birth to 18, nearly 80% of a student's waking time is spent outside of school. Schools were never intended to do it all, and they can't do it all themselves. So what's required? How do we do this? One, what's required is a commitment to building a bridge between the curriculum of the school and the curriculum in the neighborhood and home. Another way is empowering more parents to become knowledgeable about the education system, developing reciprocal relationships within the community. They can help make sure no child is left behind outside of school. The goal is no small order. It should be to weave together the neighborhood's fabric so that good schools are able to work with caring families and strong and healthy communities. So to do this, what Kim and I really kind of pulled out of this was this whole idea of an asset-based approach to helping reduce the achievement gap. And on page 170, if you're kind of following along in the book, they really talk about this asset-based approach. And the first thing they ask you to do is think about who or what accounted for your success. Who are the people that had an impact on your decisions in life, where you are today? And most public discussions about young people focus on what's wrong with them. So we have these awesome people that helped us, but most of the time when we say, okay, a kid's been a kind of a pain in the butt, we focus on what's wrong. You know, the subtext of much of what we hear about race and class is that things would be better if only these young people were white and middle class. Yet according to the research developed by the Search Institute, in Minnesota, a much more productive approach would be to concentrate on the assets of young people, not their deficits. Most young people can draw on about 20 of them as they grow up, which turns out to be a kind of critical mass for adult success. Kids with fewer than 10 of these assets in their lives are likely to wind up in trouble. Those with 30 or more normally hit the ground running when they reach adulthood. And for the next couple minutes, we're going to talk about that. This whole research has 8 assets, so, basically 8 categories of assets. If you look in your book on page 173 and 174, the breakdown and specifically what those assets mean, that's where you'll find them. But they're broken into about 8 categories. And you have external assets, which are on this slide, which are support from family and neighborhood, a sense of empowerment, clear boundaries and expectations, and constructive use of time. And you have internal factors, assets, commitment to learning, positive values, social competencies, and positive sense of self. The next, I think I've got 6 slides, 8 slides of data, and you can find this in your book on page 172 as well. There's some specific things that assets versus deficits, and the negative behaviors and the positive behaviors that come out of it. A lot of assets come from the home and the community, not the school. There's 2 things I want you to keep in mind. The best predictor of a child's success is whether that child came from a healthy, strong, supportive family. And the second best predictor is bonding with school. The more assets young people have, the better their chances of avoiding destructive behavior later. Robert says, who is the one who talked about this asset idea. This data comes from 100,000 middle and high school students, and they indicate that youth with the most assets are far less likely to engage in high-risk behavior involving alcohol, drugs, violence, and sexual activity. Fully 53% of students with 10 or fewer assets experience problems with alcohol abuse, for example. By contrast, only 3% of those with 31 or more assets to draw on encounter the same problem. And this is what I've given you. Youth with 0 to 10 assets and the negative behaviors that correspond with it, alcohol use, illicit drug use, sexual activity, and violence. And these are 53 times more likely to get involved in those particular negative behaviors. And here's the positive side. So people with 0 to 10 assets are only 7% more likely to succeed in school, 34% more likely to value diversity, maintain good health, and delay sexual gratification. And you can go through each one of these. This one's 11 to 20 assets. This one's 11 to 20. This is the positive behaviors. This one's 21 to 30 assets. And the negative to the positive. And this one's 31 to 40, negative to positive. It just kind of floors me. I think this is a really interesting idea. One that's pretty cool. It'd be difficult, I think, in some instances to do these. Robert offers a self-evident truth when he says, those of us who came from difficult circumstances, I think I have it right here, know that some of the most important people in our young lives had a vision for us that we didn't have for ourselves. They believed in us when we couldn't believe in our own future. One of the challenges you will face in dealing with race and class is how to create situations in which every kid, which more and more assets can be provided to every student who needs them. This, I think, is the most challenging. And how do you do it? I'd love to have some more information about this specific thing. In the book, or actually Peter Block, who talks about this, says, how do we move from conversations that focus on deficits to those that encourage giftedness, and how can we educate facilitators to have these conversations? I think this is an interesting idea. All of this leads me to think we need to create our own agenda, and it needs to be an agenda that is painstakingly built on creating relationships, not something built by a stranger showing up with a plan. We need connection before content, and that the small group is the unit of transformation. Turn in small, knees together groups, and then discuss with the larger group the next questions. What brought you to this meeting? So having these ideas, bringing these people together. What struck you about the conversations? What am I doing to create the world I want? I think those are kind of some interesting things. If you brought people in to have this discussion, bringing them in, asking them, what can we do? How do we create the world we want by using assets as opposed to deficits? In the book, on page 177, there's a pastor who looks at assets. It's kind of an interesting story.